The magnolia trees barely moved in the Georgia heat, but their scent hung thick in the air, sweet, almost sickening, as two figures stood frozen at the edge of the tobacco fields. It was April 15, 1853, just past midnight, and Thomas Edward Caldwell's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Beside him, Dinah clutched a cloth bundle so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Neither spoke. The silence between them carried more weight than any words could. The weight of what they were about to do, what they were about to lose, and what would happen if anyone discovered them here. Behind them, the Caldwell plantation house loomed like a monument to everything Thomas had been raised to protect. 3 stories of white columns and Georgian brick, dark windows staring out like blind eyes. All except one. In Colonel Edmund Caldwell's study, a single oil lamp still burned, a small point of light that made Thomas's chest tighten with something between guilt and grief. His father was awake. Reading ledgers, probably. Counting property. Counting the 62 human beings he owned as easily as he counted acres of land. Dinah's breath came quick and shallow. Thomas could hear it even though she stood 3 feet away, maintaining the distance they'd kept for 2 years, the careful space that had kept them alive this long. Tonight, that distance would finally close. It had to. "If they catch us," Dinah whispered, her voice so low Thomas almost missed it, "they'll send me to the rice fields in South Carolina. You know what that means." He knew. Everyone knew. The rice plantations in the Lowcountry were death sentences dressed up as sales. Enslaved people lasted 2, maybe 3 years in those swamps before malaria or exhaustion or brutality finished them. "And you," she continued, meeting his eyes for the first time since they'd arrived at this spot. "Your father will have you declared insane. Locked away somewhere. You'll disappear." Thomas nodded. They'd discussed this a dozen times in stolen moments over the past month. The risks hadn't changed. If anything, they'd grown clearer, sharper, more terrifying. But so had the alternative. In 6 months, Thomas was supposed to marry Catherine and Hartwell, a woman he'd met twice and felt nothing for. In 2 weeks, Dinah would be sold away, ripped from her mother, from everything she'd ever known, sent to a place where she'd work herself to death in flooded fields under an overseer's whip. They'd both be gone, just in different ways. "I'm certain," Thomas said, answering the question she hadn't asked. 2 horses waited in the tree line, already saddled. Thomas had packed supplies over the past week, forged freedom papers, currency, a pistol he desperately hoped he wouldn't need to fire. He'd planned the route north through back roads and forest paths, memorized the locations of underground railroad stations in Tennessee. He'd thought of everything. Everything except how to stop his hands from shaking. Dinah adjusted the bundle in her arms, a dress her mother had sewn, a wooden carving from the father she barely remembered, a scrap of paper with her own name written in letters she'd taught herself to form. Everything she owned in this world fit in a piece of cloth the size of a pillowcase. "Before we do this," she said, her voice steadier now, "I need you to understand something. If they catch us, you can't fight. You can't try to save me. If you fight, they'll kill you. And I can't." Her voice cracked. "I can't carry that." Thomas wanted to argue, to promise he'd protect her no matter what. But they both knew the truth. In 1853 Georgia, a white man and a black woman running away together wasn't just forbidden, it was incomprehensible. The punishment wouldn't be legal or rational. It would be absolute. "We won't get caught," he said, knowing it was a lie, needing to say it anyway. Dinah almost smiled. "You're a terrible liar." For just a moment, one brief, fragile moment, they stood there and let themselves imagine it. Freedom. A life where they could speak without whispering, touch without fear, exist as themselves instead of the roles society had carved out for them. Then Thomas moved toward the horses, and Dinah followed, and the moment shattered into movement. They mounted in silence. Thomas's horse shifted nervously, sensing the tension. Dinah's bundle hung from her saddle like an anchor. The lamp in Colonel Caldwell's study still burned. Thomas took one last look at the only home he'd ever known, the house where he'd been born, the land he was supposed to inherit, the future that had been planned for him since birth. Then he turned his horse north, and Dinah did the same, and together they rode into darkness so complete it felt like stepping off the edge of the world. Behind them, the Caldwell plantation stood silent. The stars overhead seemed dimmer than usual, as though even the sky knew what was coming. Within 6 hours, the alarm would sound. Within a day, professional hunters would be tracking them with dogs. Within 3 days, it would all be over. But for now, for these few stolen hours, they rode through the Georgia night as though freedom was something they could actually reach. As though love was reason enough to risk everything. As though the world they were born into could ever let them go. Before we continue, I need to ask you something. If you're listening from anywhere in the Deep South, or from any corner of this country where hidden histories still whisper through the walls of old buildings, leave a comment telling me where you're from. This channel survives because of listeners like you who hunger for the truth that history tried to bury. Hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear has never been told in full. And stories like this deserve to be remembered. To understand why Thomas Edward Caldwell chose to throw away everything on that April night, you need to know what everything actually meant. He was 23 years old in the spring of 1853, and from the moment he could walk, people had been telling him exactly who he was supposed to become. The only son of Colonel Edmund Caldwell, heir to 300 acres of prime tobacco land in Burke County, Georgia. Future master of 62 human beings whose names appeared in his father's ledgers right next to the livestock counts. Thomas had grown up in that white-columned house, playing in rooms filled with furniture shipped from Europe, eating meals prepared by hands that were never thanked, wearing clothes mended by fingers that were never free. He'd been taught to ride by the age of 5, to shoot by 7, to manage plantation accounts by 10. By 12, he understood that everything he saw, the fields, the crops, the people working them, would one day be his responsibility. His father made sure he understood the weight of that inheritance. A Caldwell doesn't just own land, Colonel Edmund had told him more times than Thomas could count. We uphold civilization itself. Without order, without structure, without men willing to shoulder the burden of command, this entire society collapses into chaos. Thomas had believed it once. Or at least, he'd never questioned it. Then came the University of Georgia. For 4 years, Thomas studied law and philosophy in Athens, surrounded by young men from families just like his. They debated constitutional principles and states' rights, read Greek philosophers and English political theorists, argued passionately about liberty and natural law and the rights of man. The professors never seemed to notice the contradiction. Thomas did. Slowly at first, then with growing discomfort that kept him awake at night, he began to see the gap between the ideals they discussed in classrooms and the reality he returned to every holiday. They quoted Locke on natural rights while their families held people in bondage. They praised the founding fathers' vision of freedom while conveniently ignoring that many of those founders had owned slaves themselves. It started as intellectual discomfort. By the time Thomas graduated and returned home permanently in the fall of 1852, it had become something much harder to ignore. The theoretical debates felt hollow now. When his father discussed purchasing a new field hand at auction, Thomas saw a human being torn from family. When the overseer reported a woman punished for slowness in her work, Thomas saw injustice dressed up as management. When guests at dinner parties spoke casually about their property, Thomas heard people discussing other people as though they were furniture. And he said nothing. because speaking would mean challenging his father, challenging his entire society, admitting that everything he'd been raised to protect was built on something monstrous. So Thomas stayed silent and felt his conscience corrode a little more each day. His father had plans, of course. That spring, Colonel Edmund announced them over dinner with the casual authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You'll marry Catherine and Hartwell in October," he said, cutting into roasted pork that Patience had prepared in the kitchen. "Her father and I have agreed on terms. The union will bring the Hartwell property adjacent to ours under family control. 1,000 acres combined. You'll give me grandchildren and carry on the Caldwell name with the respect it deserves." Thomas had met Catherine and twice. She was pleasant enough, well-educated, appropriate, exactly the kind of wife a man in his position was expected to take. He felt nothing for her. She clearly felt nothing for him. It didn't matter. Marriage in their world wasn't about love. It was about land, legacy, and maintaining social position. "Yes, sir," Thomas had said, because what else could he say? That night, and many nights after, he'd retreated to the plantation library, a room lined floor to ceiling with books his father never read but kept because educated men were supposed to own libraries. Thomas would light a lamp and pull volumes at random, searching for something he couldn't name. Permission, maybe. Or absolution. Or proof that the growing conviction in his chest wasn't madness. He read philosophy that argued all men were created equal. He read abolitionist writings smuggled in from the North. He read slave narratives that made him physically sick with shame. And he kept searching, kept reading, kept hoping to find an answer that would let him remain who he was while somehow becoming who he wanted to be. He never found it. What he found instead, one afternoon in late July of 1851, was a girl standing in front of those shelves with a book of poetry trembling in her hands. And everything changed. Dinah woke every morning before dawn in the quarters behind the Caldwell house, a collection of rough cabins where 62 people lived in spaces barely large enough to turn around in. She'd been born in one of those cabins 16 years earlier, delivered by hands that knew how to bring enslaved children into a world that would never belong to them. Her mother, Patience, worked in the kitchen, had worked there since she was 12 years old, cooking meals for white people who never once asked her name. Patience's hands were scarred from hot pans and years of labor, but they were gentle when they touched her daughter's face in the early morning darkness. Dinah's father was a memory she didn't really have. He'd been sold away before her second birthday, payment for Colonel Caldwell's gambling debt in Savannah. One day he was there, the next he wasn't. Patience never spoke about him except once, when Dinah was old enough to ask. "He carved you a little horse from wood," Patience had said quietly. "Spent 3 evenings on it. You carried it everywhere." She'd paused, her voice going distant. "When they took him, you cried for that horse more than anything. I think you were too young to understand he wasn't coming back." Dinah still had the horse. It sat wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her bundle, one of the only proofs she'd ever had a father at all. Her childhood had been work, just different kinds as she grew. At 5, she carried water to the field hands during harvest season, the bucket almost as big as she was. At 8, she learned to card cotton, her small fingers bleeding until they toughened. By 12, she was sewing and mending clothes for the entire plantation. Shirts, dresses, sheets that needed constant repair. She learned early what every enslaved girl learned: make yourself invisible. Move through spaces without drawing attention. Never look white men directly in the eyes. Never speak unless spoken to. Survive by becoming so unremarkable that you're forgotten the moment you leave a room. But inside, where no one could see, Dinah was something else entirely. She could read. It was the most dangerous thing she possessed, more dangerous than a weapon, more forbidden than running away. In Georgia in 1853, teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal. Getting caught with that knowledge meant punishment severe enough to serve as warning to everyone else. Dinah's mother had learned as a young girl from a Quaker woman who'd visited the plantation before such visits became impossible. That woman had believed enslaved people deserved education, deserved dignity, deserved to know the words that filled the books white people kept locked away. She'd taught patience in secret, late at night, risking everything to pass along something that could never be taken back. And Patience had given that same gift to her daughter. On nights when the rest of the quarter slept, when the overseer had finished his rounds and the plantation house lights had all gone dark, Patience would kneel beside Dinah in their cabin. By candlelight so dim it barely qualified as light at all, she'd trace letters in the dirt floor. "This is A," she'd whisper. "This is B. Watch how my finger moves." Dinah learned the alphabet by age 7. By 9, she could sound out simple words. By 12, she was reading whatever scraps of paper she could find. Old newspapers used as wrapping, discarded letters, anything with words on it. Reading opened up entire worlds she'd never be allowed to enter. It let her imagine places beyond Burke County, beyond Georgia, beyond the only life she'd ever known. When she read, she wasn't property. She was just a person encountering ideas, following stories, thinking thoughts that belonged to no one but herself. She had soft brown eyes that her mother said came from her father's side. Her hands were calloused from years of needlework, but they moved with a grace that hadn't been beaten out of her yet. There was something unbroken still living inside Dinah, not hope exactly, because hope required believing in futures that seemed impossible, but something like resilience. Something that refused to accept that this was all she'd ever be. She hid it well. To everyone on the plantation, she was quiet, obedient, unremarkable. She did her work without complaint, kept her eyes down, spoke when required, and stayed silent the rest of the time. No one suspected she spent her nights tracing letters in dirt, sounding out words in her head, building an inner life rich enough to survive the outer one. In July of 1851, the overseer assigned her new duties. The plantation house needed cleaning, dusting, organizing, tasks that required someone careful and quiet. "You'll start in the library," he told her one morning, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man who'd never questioned his right to give orders. "Books need dusting. Shelves need organizing. Don't touch anything you don't need to. Don't linger. Get in, get the work done, get out." Dinah nodded, keeping her face neutral. But inside, her heart had started racing. The library. A room filled with books. Hundreds of them, probably. Words covering entire walls. She'd never been allowed inside. That afternoon, when she pushed open the library door and saw the shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, Dinah forgot every lesson she'd ever learned about staying invisible. She walked straight to those shelves like they were calling her name. The library smelled like leather and old paper and something else Dinah couldn't quite name. Privilege, maybe, or time. Dust particles floated in the afternoon sunlight coming through tall windows, making the air look thick and golden. She'd been dusting for 20 minutes, moving methodically along the shelves like the overseer had instructed, when she saw it. A slim volume bound in dark green cloth, tucked between larger books like it was hiding. The title was barely visible, but Dinah could make out the word poetry, stamped in faded gold letters. Her hand moved before her mind could stop it. She pulled the book from the shelf, opened it to a random page, and started reading. The words were beautiful. Sad and beautiful in ways that made her chest ache. Lines about loss and longing, and the weight of carrying secrets no one else could understand. Dinah read silently, her lips moving slightly, completely forgetting where she was or what she was supposed to be doing. She didn't hear the door open. "Can you read what's written there?" Dinah's entire body went cold. The book nearly slipped from her hands. She spun around to find Thomas Edward Caldwell standing in the doorway, staring at her with an expression she couldn't interpret. This was it. She'd be punished. Maybe worse than punished. Teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal, but being caught reading was proof of the crime. Her mother would be questioned. They'd both face consequences that didn't bear thinking about. "I asked you a question," Thomas said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Can you read those words?" Dinah's mind raced through possible responses. Deny it. Pretend she'd just been looking at the pages? Beg for mercy? But something in his face stopped her. He didn't look angry. He looked curious. Almost hopeful, though that made no sense at all. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible. Thomas moved closer, and Dinah forced herself not to back away. He stopped about 6 feet from her, close enough to hear, far enough to maintain the distance society demanded. "Read it," he said. Out loud. Her hands were shaking so badly the pages rustled. But Dinah looked down at the poem and began to read, her voice trembling at first, then growing steadier as the words took over. When she finished, silence filled the library like water filling a well. Thomas stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Who taught you?" "I can't tell you that." "Your mother." Dinah said nothing, which was answer enough. Thomas walked to the window, his back to her now, hands clasped behind him like he was trying to solve a complicated problem. "You could be punished for this. Severely. You understand that?" "Yes. And you did it anyway." It wasn't a question, but Dinah answered anyway. "Yes." Thomas turned back to face her. "Why?" "Because reading made her human in a world determined to treat her as property. Because words were the only thing she could possess that couldn't be sold away. Because her mother had given her this gift at tremendous risk, and Dinah had honored that gift by using it. But she couldn't say any of that to the master's son. "I wanted to," she said simply. Something shifted in Thomas's expression. He looked at her differently now. Not as something that existed to serve him, but as someone who'd just surprised him in a way he hadn't thought possible. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "Same time. I won't report this. But I want to talk to you." Over the following months, a pattern developed that would have gotten them both killed if anyone had discovered it. Thomas would leave books in specific places on the shelves, places only someone who knew the library's organization would notice. Dinah would find them during her cleaning duties, read them at night by candlelight in her cabin, then return them the next day with passages marked by tiny, nearly invisible creases in the pages. They talked. Carefully at first, always aware of the danger, never speaking long enough to draw suspicion. But the conversations grew deeper, more honest, more dangerous. They discussed the poetry she'd first been caught reading. Then philosophy. Then the questions neither of them was supposed to ask out loud. About freedom, about humanity, about what it meant that he could read openly while she risked her life to do the same. Thomas would sit in the leather chair by the window. Dinah would stand near the shelves, still maintaining that careful distance, still ready to grab a dusting cloth if anyone entered. The afternoon light would slant through the windows, and the smell of old paper would surround them, and for an hour at a time they'd exist in a space that wasn't quite the real world. "What did you think of Locke?" Thomas would ask, referring to a philosophy text he'd left for her. "He says all men are born equal," Dinah would reply. "But he doesn't actually mean all men, does he?" Thomas would nod slowly. No, he doesn't. Then what good are the words? It was a question Thomas had been asking himself for months. Hearing it from her made it impossible to ignore. The sound of turning pages became their code. If someone approached, Dinah would flip through a book quickly, the rustling noise a warning that they needed to stop talking, needed to return to their assigned roles. Thomas would shift to discussing mundane plantation business in a louder voice. Dinah would return to dusting with her eyes lowered. But when they were alone again, they'd pick up exactly where they'd left off. Intellectual respect turned to fascination, so gradually Thomas didn't notice it happening. He started finding excuses to be in the library during Dinah's assigned cleaning time. He began choosing books specifically for her, ones he thought she'd find interesting, ones that would challenge her, ones that would give them something new to discuss. He found himself counting the hours between their conversations. Found himself thinking about her observations long after she'd left the room. Found himself respecting her mind in ways that terrified him because it meant acknowledging she was his equal in every way that mattered, and therefore that the system keeping her enslaved was built on a lie. One afternoon in October, 3 months after that first meeting, Thomas realized something that made his hands go cold. He wasn't just fascinated by her intelligence anymore. He was falling in love. By winter of 1852, Thomas and Dinah had created a language that existed only between them, one spoken in glances across the plantation yard that carried entire conversations, in books left open to specific pages, in the careful way they positioned themselves in the same room while never appearing to acknowledge each other's presence. They'd grown bolder out of necessity. The afternoon library meetings weren't enough anymore. Thomas started coming to the library late at night when the entire household slept, leaving a lamp burning low as a signal. Dinah would slip from the quarters after her mother's breathing had settled into sleep, moving through darkness she knew by heart, entering through the kitchen door that never quite latched properly. They'd talk in whispers for an hour, maybe 2. Always listening for footsteps. Always ready with an excuse that wouldn't save either of them if they were discovered. Thomas began leaving notes tucked into book pages, observations about something they discussed, questions he wanted her opinion on, passages he thought she'd appreciate. Dinah would respond in the margins of those same pages, her handwriting small and precise, before returning the books to their designated spots. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was the only thing keeping either of them sane. Thomas started changing in ways his father couldn't ignore. At dinner one evening in December, Colonel Caldwell mentioned the upcoming winter auction, the annual event where plantation owners bought and sold enslaved people like livestock. "We'll be selling the Turner family," the colonel said casually, cutting into his meal. "The father's getting too old for field work, and we don't need 3 extra mouths to feed." Thomas's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "You're separating them? The children are under 10 years old. Business is business, son. You'll understand when you're managing the property yourself." "I understand now," Thomas said, his voice tight. "I understand it's cruel." The table went silent. Colonel Caldwell stared at his son like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. "Cruel," the colonel repeated slowly. "You think maintaining economic viability is cruel? You think feeding this household, paying our debts, keeping this plantation running is accomplished through sentiment?" Thomas should have backed down, should have apologized, claimed the wine had loosened his tongue. Instead, he pressed forward. "What about manumission? We could free the older ones who've served their time. It's done in other states." "Enough." The colonel's voice cut like a blade. "You've spent too much time in those books. They're filling your head with dangerous ideas. This discussion is over. But Thomas kept bringing it up. At the auction, he argued against purchases that would separate families. He questioned the overseer's punishment methods. He spoke about enslaved people in ways that made dinner guests uncomfortable, as though they were people, not property. Colonel Caldwell watched his son with growing alarm, not understanding what had caused this transformation but determined to correct it before it became permanent. He didn't know the cause sat in the quarters every night, lying awake and terrified. For Dinah, what was happening felt like standing on ice that was cracking beneath her feet. Being seen as fully human by Thomas was exhilarating in ways she'd never experienced, like being allowed to breathe deeply for the first time in her life. He asked her opinions and actually listened to the answers. He valued her thoughts. He saw her. But he saw her in a world where being seen was deadly. She loved him. She'd known it for months but hadn't named it, as though keeping the word unspoken might make it less dangerous. But love didn't care about danger. It grew anyway, like weeds through floorboards, persistent and impossible to uproot. And loving Thomas meant carrying constant terror. Terror that they'd be discovered. Terror that his growing rebellion would expose them both. Terror that even if they somehow survived this, they had no future. None. Their connection wasn't just forbidden, it was incomprehensible to the society they lived in. A white plantation heir and an enslaved girl couldn't love each other. The very concept violated every rule the South was built on. Patience noticed her daughter's distraction. Noticed her slipping out at night when she thought everyone was sleeping. Noticed the way Dinah's eyes would find Thomas across the plantation yard and linger just a second too long. One morning while preparing breakfast, Patience grabbed Dinah's wrist, not hard, but firm enough to get her attention. "Whatever you're doing," she whispered, her voice urgent and frightened. "Stop. Do you hear me? Stop before it destroys you." Dinah met her mother's eyes and saw raw fear there. Patience knew. Maybe not the details, but enough. "Mama. Don't tell me. I don't want to know." Patience released her daughter's wrist but held her gaze. "Just stop, please. While you still can." But Dinah couldn't stop. Neither could Thomas. In January, on a night so cold their breath formed clouds in the lamplight, Thomas sat in the library chair and watched Dinah return a book to its shelf. The way she moved. The way lamplight caught in her eyes. The intelligence in her voice when she challenged something he'd said about a philosophical text. He'd been telling himself this was intellectual fascination. Rebellion against his father's values. A friendship that defied social conventions but remained within certain boundaries. He'd been lying to himself. This wasn't fascination. This wasn't rebellion. This was love, complete, consuming, and utterly impossible. And God helped them both, because there was no way this could end well. March came to Burke County with false spring warmth that wouldn't last. On a Tuesday evening, Colonel Caldwell made his announcement over roasted duck and potatoes that Patience had spent all day preparing. "Thomas, you'll marry Catherine and Hartwell on October 12th, he said, his tone allowing no room for discussion. "Her father and I finalized arrangements this afternoon. The Hartwell property adjoins ours to the east, 1,000 acres combined once the union is complete. We'll host the wedding here. I expect 200 guests minimum." Thomas's knife clattered against his plate. His mother looked up sharply, then back down, having learned long ago not to interfere when her husband made pronouncements. "I haven't agreed to this," Thomas said quietly. "You don't need to agree. You need to obey." Colonel Caldwell took a long drink of wine. "You're 23 years old, Thomas. It's past time you settled down, started a family, took your responsibilities seriously. Catherine and is from excellent stock. She'll give you strong sons. Thomas felt the walls of his life closing in like a coffin being nailed shut. 6 months. He had 6 months before they'd chain him to a woman he didn't love, a future he didn't want, a life that would suffocate everything he'd become. He opened his mouth to argue, but his father's expression made it clear the conversation was over. 3 days later, Thomas was reviewing accounts in his father's study when the overseer entered with a ledger. "Colonel, I've completed the reorganization list you requested," the man said. "We're selling 6 field hands to the plantation in Alabama, plus the girl from the kitchen quarters, Patience's daughter, the one who does the sewing." Thomas's blood went cold. "Dinah!" The overseer glanced at him, surprised to hear him use her name. "Yes, sir. She'll fetch a good price. Young, healthy, skilled with a needle. Buyers coming next week to transport her and the others." Thomas looked at his father, who was reviewing the ledger without expression. "You're selling her?" "It's business, Thomas. We're overstaffed in certain areas. This brings us back to efficiency." Colonel Caldwell didn't look up. "The sale is final." But Thomas saw something in his father's face, a flicker of satisfaction that had nothing to do with plantation efficiency. The colonel knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. He'd noticed Thomas's distraction, his questions, his changing attitudes. And he'd traced it back to somewhere in the quarters. This wasn't about reorganization. This was about removing a problem before it became a scandal. In the kitchen, Patience received the news and felt her world collapse for the second time in her life. First her husband, now her daughter. She'd be left with nothing, no family, no hope, just years of cooking meals for people who viewed her as equipment. She found Dinah mending clothes in the quarters and couldn't speak at first. Just pulled her daughter into her arms and held on like she could prevent the sale through sheer force of will. "When?" Dinah whispered against her mother's shoulder. "Next week. Maybe sooner." Dinah had known this could happen. Every enslaved person lived with that knowledge. You could be sold at any moment, for any reason or no reason at all. But knowing it was possible and experiencing it were entirely different things. She'd be sent away. Separated from her mother forever. Separated from Thomas. Sent to a place where no one cared that she could read, that she had thoughts and dreams, that she was more than a pair of hands to work. That evening, Thomas found a way to get a message to her. A note hidden in the kitchen where she'd find it. 3 words, "Meet me tonight." They met in their usual place, the clearing in the pine forest where the sounds of the plantation couldn't reach them. Thomas was already there when Dinah arrived, pacing like a caged animal. "I can't let them do this," he said before she could speak. "I can't let them send you away." "You have no choice," Dinah replied, her voice hollow. "Neither of us do." Thomas stopped pacing and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "There's always a choice." "What are you saying?" He moved closer, breaking the careful distance they always maintained. "I'm saying we run. We leave here. We head north, and we don't stop until we're somewhere they can't reach us." Dinah stared at him. "That's insane. They'll hunt us. They'll catch us. And when they do, I know the risks." Thomas's voice was steady now, certain. "I know exactly what we're risking. But I also know I'd rather die trying to be free with you than spend the rest of my life pretending I never loved you." The word hung in the air between them. Love, spoken out loud for the first time, making everything real and terrifying and inevitable. "We have 1 week, Thomas continued. "I can forge freedom papers. Get supplies. Plan a route. It's not much time, but it's enough." Dinah's mind raced. Running meant abandoning her mother. Running meant certain death if they were caught. Running meant trusting that love was stronger than the entire system designed to crush people like her. But staying meant losing everything anyway. 1 week, she whispered. Thomas reached for her hand, the first time he'd ever touched her. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and shaking slightly. 1 week, he agreed. And they began planning the escape that would destroy them both. The moon hung low and orange the night they finalized their plan, the kind of moon that looked close enough to touch but would always remain out of reach. Thomas arrived at the clearing first, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. When Dinah emerged from the tree line, her face half shadowed by branches, Thomas forgot every careful speech he'd prepared. "I love you," he said, the words tumbling out raw and unpolished. "I've loved you for months. Maybe longer. I know I have no right to say it, no, it doesn't change anything about the world we live in, but I need you to hear it before we do this. I love you." Dinah stopped walking. The moonlight caught in her eyes, making them shine with something that looked like tears she was refusing to shed. "I know," she whispered. "I've known. And it terrifies me, Thomas, because love doesn't save people like us. Love just gives us more to lose. Then we'll lose everything together." Thomas pulled folded papers from his jacket. "I've been working on these all week. Freedom papers. They're not perfect, but they're good enough to pass a casual inspection. We'll say you're my property being transported north for sale. It's believable enough to get us through most checkpoints." He spread the papers on a fallen log, and Dinah knelt beside him to examine them by moonlight. The forgery was surprisingly good, official-looking seals, careful handwriting, all the right legal language. "I've mapped a route," Thomas continued, his voice gaining confidence as he moved into logistics. "We'll head north through back roads, avoid main thoroughfare completely. There are stations along the Underground Railroad, safe houses, people who help runaways. I've memorized their locations. We can reach the first one in 2 days if we travel hard. And if we're stopped before we reach them? Then we're master and property. You stay silent, keep your eyes down. I do all the talking." Thomas met her gaze. "I know it's not ideal. It's survival," Dinah interrupted. "I understand the difference between pretending and being." Thomas nodded and pulled out more supplies from his bag. Currency, a knife, dried food, a compass. "I've been stockpiling these for a week. There's enough here for 2 weeks of travel, maybe 3 if we're careful. Once we cross into free territory, we can find work, establish ourselves somewhere they won't think to look." "They'll look everywhere." Dinah's voice was quiet but firm. "Your father has resources. He'll hire professional hunters. They'll track us with dogs. And when they catch us, and they will catch us, Thomas, what happens to me will make you wish we'd never tried. Then we don't get caught. That's not a plan. That's hope. Hope is all we have." Thomas reached for her hand. "Dinah, I know the odds. I know what we're risking. If they capture us, my father will have me declared insane, locked away somewhere I'll never be seen again. And you." His voice cracked. "What they'll do to you doesn't bear thinking about. But I also know that watching them sell you away, knowing I did nothing, will kill something in me that can never come back." Dinah squeezed his hand. "What about my mother? If I run, they'll question her, punish her for my escape." "I know." Thomas's face showed the weight of that knowledge. "I can't fix that. I can't protect her. All I can offer is this chance. One chance to be free. And I'm asking you to take it with me, knowing it means leaving her behind. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind through pine branches and the distant call of night birds. April 15th, Dinah finally said. That's 3 weeks away. I'm scheduled to travel to Augusta that day, on business. Perfect cover. We leave at midnight, take 2 horses, and ride north before anyone realizes we're gone. Thomas traced the route on his mental map. By the time they discover us missing the next morning, we'll have a 6-hour lead. It's not much, but it's something. 6 hours against dogs and horses and men who hunt people for a living. Dinah shook her head, but she wasn't refusing. She was calculating. We'd need to cross water, throw off the scent, stay off roads during daylight, find shelter that doesn't draw attention. I've thought of all that. I have contacts in Tennessee, abolitionists who owe my university professor favors. If we can reach them, they'll help us disappear. Dinah looked at the forged papers, the supplies, the man who was willing to sacrifice everything he'd ever known. She thought about her mother, about the quarters she'd lived in her entire life, about the small carved horse wrapped in cloth that represented the father she'd never really known. Then she thought about spending the rest of her life on a rice plantation, worked to death in flooded fields, never knowing if Thomas had gone through with the marriage, if he'd forgotten her, if any of this had mattered. April 15th, she repeated. Midnight. I'll be ready. Thomas exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for hours. He stood, pulling her up with him, and for a moment they just looked at each other. 2 people about to step off the edge of everything they knew. Then Thomas leaned forward, and Dinah met him halfway, and their lips touched for the first and only time before their escape. The kiss was brief and desperate, and tasted like salt and fear and something neither of them had words for. When they pulled apart, both were trembling. Whatever happens, Thomas whispered, I need you to know this was worth it. You are worth it. Dinah touched his face gently. Ask me that again when the dogs find us. But she smiled when she said it, a sad, small smile that acknowledged the impossibility of what they were attempting while accepting it anyway. They'd sealed their pact. April 15th. 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to prepare for either freedom or death. There wouldn't be any middle ground. April 14th, 1853, arrived with heavy spring rain that turned the plantation roads to mud and made everything smell like wet earth and desperation. Thomas woke before dawn, his stomach twisted into knots that hadn't loosened in 3 weeks. He dressed mechanically, ate breakfast without tasting it, and went through the motions of a normal day while his mind counted down the hours. 18 hours until midnight. 17. 16. His father noticed nothing. Colonel Caldwell spent the morning reviewing ledgers in his study, complaining about the rain affecting the tobacco crop, discussing business matters as though the world wasn't about to fracture down the middle. Thomas excused himself after lunch, claiming he needed to prepare for his trip to Augusta the next day. Instead, he went to the stables. His hands shook as he gathered supplies he'd been hiding over the past weeks. Dried beef wrapped in cloth, hard biscuits that would last, a canteen he'd filled with fresh water. He worked quickly, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds, certain someone would discover him. The horses he'd chosen were strong but not the finest, nothing that would be immediately missed. He saddled them both in the growing darkness, his fingers fumbling with the leather straps. Then he loaded the pistol his father had given him for his 21st birthday, the weight of it foreign and terrible in his palm. He prayed he wouldn't need to use it. Prayed even harder that if the moment came, he'd have the courage to. In the quarters, Dinah moved through her final day like a ghost. She helped her mother prepare meals in the kitchen, her movements automatic, her mind somewhere else entirely. Everything she did felt weighted with finality. The last time she'd need bread in this kitchen, the last time she'd carry water from the well, the last time she'd see the sun set over the tobacco fields that had been her entire world. Patience watched her daughter with eyes that knew too much and said nothing. She'd felt this heaviness before, the night before they'd sold her husband away. The air had felt like this then too, thick with endings. That evening, as they prepared dinner, Patience finally broke the silence. "Whatever you're planning," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of chopping vegetables, "be smart, be careful, and remember you're loved." Dinah's hands stilled on the knife. "Mama, don't tell me. I don't want to know the details." Patience set down her own knife and pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace. "But I'm not a fool, child. I see how you've been these past weeks. I see where your eyes go when you think no one's watching." She held Dinah at arm's length, memorizing her daughter's face like she'd never see it again. Maybe she wouldn't. "God be with you," Patience whispered, and then she pressed something into Dinah's hand, a small cloth bundle containing cornbread and dried fruit, enough for a few days if rationed carefully. "Now go finish your work before someone notices." Later that night, while the plantation house settled into sleep, Dinah packed her entire life into a single cloth bundle. The dress Patience had sewn for her 3 summers ago, still her best one. The carved wooden horse her father had made before he was sold away, her only proof he'd existed at all. And a scrap of paper on which she'd written her own name in careful letters, proof that she could claim herself through words. That was everything. 16 years of life fit into a bundle the size of a loaf of bread. In the main house, Thomas sat at the library desk with paper and ink, composing the letter he'd been writing in his head for weeks. His hand moved across the page, forming words he'd never be able to take back. "Father," he began, then crossed it out. Started again. "Colonel Caldwell, you taught me honor, duty, and responsibility. You taught me to value our family name above all else. You taught me that a Caldwell's word is sacred, that our legacy must be preserved, that we carry the weight of civilization itself on our shoulders. But you never taught me humanity. You never taught me to see the people you own as people at all. I have learned that lesson elsewhere, and I cannot unlearn it now. By the time you read this, I will be gone. Do not search for me. Do not attempt to bring me back. I am making a choice that will destroy me in your eyes, but it is the only choice that allows me to remain human in my own. You will call it madness. You will call it betrayal. Call it whatever you need to. But know that I learned what matters most from the very system you built. I learned it from someone you considered property, who turned out to be worth more than everything you tried to give me. I hope someday you understand. I suspect you never will. Your son, Thomas." He folded the letter carefully and left it on the desk where his father would find it in the morning. Then he walked away from that room, from that house, from that life, without looking back. Downstairs, Colonel Caldwell poured himself a glass of brandy and opened the plantation ledger. He made notes about crop rotation, calculated profits from the upcoming tobacco season, planned purchases for next year's planting. His world was ordered, predictable, exactly as it should be. He had no idea it was ending. In the quarters, the families who lived in those cramped cabins whispered about Dinah. Everyone knew she was being sold away within days. Some offered prayers for her safety wherever she ended up. Others shook their heads and warned that resistance only made things worse, that survival meant accepting what couldn't be changed. One old woman who'd survived 40 years of bondage touched Dinah's shoulder as she passed. "May you find what you're looking for, child," she said quietly. "And may it be worth the price." As midnight approached, Thomas slipped out of the house through the kitchen door, moving through shadows he'd known his entire life. The rain had stopped, leaving everything wet and heavy and smelling of earth. Dinah left the quarters for the last time, her bundle clutched to her chest, her mother's whispered blessing still echoing in her ears. They met at the edge of the property where manicured lawn gave way to wild forest, the boundary between the world they knew and whatever waited beyond. The horses stood ready, saddled and loaded. The forged papers were folded in Thomas's jacket. The pistol sat heavy in his waistband. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Two people standing at the edge of an abyss, knowing that once they stepped forward, there would be no coming back. "Last chance," Dinah whispered. "You can still change your mind. Go back to your bed. Pretend this never happened. Marry the Hartwell girl. Live the life you were born into." Thomas shook his head. "That life died the day I met you in the library. Then we're both ghosts already." "Maybe. But at least we'll be ghosts together." They mounted the horses. Thomas took one final look at the plantation house, his birthright, his prison, his past. Then he turned his horse north, and Dinah followed, and together they rode into darkness so complete it felt like the end of the world. Behind them, the Caldwell plantation slept. By dawn, it would wake to discover what they'd done. And then the hunting would begin. Dawn broke on April 15th with the kind of light that promised a beautiful day, soft and golden, the rain from the night before leaving everything clean and fresh. The overseer made his morning rounds, counting heads in the quarters like he did every day, ensuring all the colonel's property was accounted for. Then he noticed Dinah was missing. At first, he assumed she was in the kitchen helping patients with breakfast. But when he checked there and found only the mother working alone, her face carefully blank, alarm bells started ringing in his head. He went to the stables next. Found 2 horses gone. Saddles missing. Supplies disturbed. The overseer ran to the main house, taking the stairs 2 at a time, pounding on Colonel Caldwell's study door before remembering to knock properly. "Sir, we have a situation. The patient's girl is gone, and so is—" He stopped, noticing Thomas's door standing open down the hall, the room empty. "Sir, I think Master Thomas might be missing as well." Colonel Caldwell was already dressed, having woken early to review contracts before breakfast. He walked to Thomas's room, saw the undisturbed bed, and felt something cold settle in his chest. Back in the study, he noticed the letter on his desk immediately. His name written in his son's hand across the folded paper. He read it once. Then again. The paper began to crumple in his fist as the words sank in. "No," he whispered. Then louder. "No, he didn't. He couldn't have." But the evidence was undeniable. His son, his only son, the heir to everything he'd built, had run off with an enslaved girl like some kind of common criminal. Like a madman. Like a traitor to everything the Caldwell name stood for. Colonel Caldwell's face went through a transformation the overseer would remember for the rest of his life. Confusion first, as he tried to make sense of words that made no sense. Then rage, bright and hot, that made the veins in his neck stand out. Finally, something worse than rage. A kind of devastated understanding that his son was lost to him completely, and nothing would ever be the same. "Get riders," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Every man we have. Send word to the sheriff in Waynesboro. I want notices posted in every town within 50 miles. And find me professional trackers, the best ones. Men who know how to hunt runaways. Sir, if I may, Master Thomas is your son. Perhaps we should." "My son died last night," Colonel Caldwell interrupted, his voice like stone. "What rode off that property is something else. Something I don't recognize. Find them. Bring them back. Whatever it costs." Within an hour, riders were fanning out across Burke County. The sheriff was notified. Professional slave catchers, hard men who made their living tracking human beings with dogs trained to follow scent trails, were hired with the promise of a reward substantial enough to make them drop everything else. The story spread faster than the riders. By noon, every plantation within 20 miles knew. Thomas Edward Caldwell, educated at the University of Georgia, heir to one of the wealthiest families in Burke County, had run off with a slave girl. The scandal was absolute. It was unthinkable. It violated every rule of Southern society so completely that people struggled to even find words for it. White families who'd known Thomas since childhood gathered in parlors and at dinner tables, speaking his name with disgust and disbelief. He'd betrayed his class, his race, his heritage. He'd thrown away everything for something incomprehensible, love for someone who wasn't even considered fully human under the law. Insanity, they whispered. Has to be. No sane man would do such a thing. In the quarters across neighboring plantations, enslaved people heard a different version of the story. They whispered it in voices filled with wonder and terror, wonder that such love could exist, terror about what would happen when the couple was inevitably caught. Some saw it as proof that humanity could transcend the brutal system crushing them. Others warned it was foolishness that would only end in death. All of them knew how this would end. The South didn't let people escape. Especially not when one of them was white and the other was black and they dared to love each other. Meanwhile, Thomas and Dinah rode hard through the first day, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the Caldwell plantation. They stayed off main roads, cutting through forest and farmland, following paths Thomas had memorized during his weeks of planning. They didn't speak much. Speaking required breath they needed for riding. But Thomas would glance back periodically to make sure Dinah was still there, still keeping pace, still with him. And she'd meet his eyes and nod, and they'd keep going. By sunset of the first day, they'd made it nearly 30 miles north. They stopped at a small farm owned by free blacks, people Thomas had identified through careful research as sympathetic to runaways. The family there gave them bread and dried meat, refilled their water, warned them about patrol routes they'd need to avoid. "God be with you," the farmer's wife said as they prepared to leave. "You're going to need all the help you can get." The second night, they slept in a barn outside a small town whose name Thomas didn't know. They took turns keeping watch, too terrified to both sleep at once. At dawn, they washed in a creek, cold water that made Dinah gasp but woke them both up fully. For a few hours that morning, huddled together eating stale bread, they almost let themselves believe this might work. "Tennessee border is maybe another day's hard ride," Thomas said, studying the compass and map he'd brought. "Once we cross it, we'll be closer to stations I know about. People who can hide us properly." Dinah nodded but didn't smile. She'd heard the dogs in the distance yesterday afternoon, faint but unmistakable. The hunters were behind them, and they were getting closer. Behind them, the pursuit was methodical and organized. The slave catchers Colonel Caldwell had hired were professionals. They'd brought bloodhounds that could follow a scent trail days old. They moved with the efficiency of men who'd done this hundreds of times before. The network of white supremacy that held the South together was tightening around Thomas and Dinah like a noose. Every town had been notified. Every patrol was watching. Every white person they might encounter was a potential threat. By the third night, they'd made it to a tobacco barn outside Washington, Georgia, less than 20 miles from the Tennessee border. They were exhausted, their horses worn down, their supplies running low. But they were close. So close. Thomas let himself believe, for the first time since they'd fled, that they might actually make it. They settled into the barn as darkness fell. Dinah leaned against him, and Thomas wrapped his arm around her shoulders. Neither spoke. They just sat there in the hay-scented darkness, listening to their horses' breathing, feeling each other's presence like proof that this was real. "Tomorrow," Thomas whispered. "Tomorrow we cross into Tennessee." And then he stopped. In the distance, so faint he almost missed it, came a sound that made his blood turn to ice. Dogs barking. Getting closer. Dinah heard it too. Her entire body went rigid against his. "Thomas, I know." He was already moving, already reaching for the pistol at his waist, already knowing it wouldn't be enough. The barking grew louder. Then came the sound of horses. Men's voices calling to each other through the darkness. They'd been found. And there was nowhere left to run. The dogs hit the barn door first. Massive bloodhounds trained to track humans sent through swamps and forests, their barking so loud it seemed to shake the wooden walls. Thomas had his hand on the pistol, his fingers closing around the grip, when Dinah grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror in her eyes. "If you shoot, they'll kill you. Please, don't." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw she was right. The pistol held 6 bullets. There were at least a dozen men outside, probably more. Firing would only guarantee his death and change nothing about her fate. He let his hand fall away from the weapon. The barn door exploded inward. Torches flooded the space with orange light that made everything look hellish. Men poured in, professional slave catchers with guns drawn, followed by local volunteers eager to be part of catching the scandal everyone was talking about. The lead tracker was a man named Howell, known throughout Georgia for never losing a trail. He took one look at Thomas, and Dinah huddled in the corner and smiled. The satisfied smile of a man about to collect a substantial reward. "Thomas Edward Caldwell," Howell said, pulling a notice from his coat. "And the runaway slave Dinah, property of Colonel Edmund Caldwell. You two led us on quite a chase." Thomas stood slowly, positioning himself between Dinah and the men. "This is a misunderstanding. She's my property. I'm transporting her north for sale. I have papers. Save it." Howell gestured, and 2 men moved forward. "We got a notice from your father himself. Describes you both perfectly. Offers a reward that'll keep us fed for a year. Now, you can come peaceable, or we can make this difficult. Your choice." Thomas's mind raced through options that didn't exist. Fight. They'd shoot him and take Dinah anyway. Run. They were surrounded. Negotiate. With what leverage? He had nothing. They had everything. "At least let me," Thomas began, reaching toward Dinah. That's when they grabbed him. 4 men at once, pulling him away from her, pinning his arms behind his back. Thomas fought instinctively, driven by desperation rather than hope, knowing it was pointless but unable to stop himself. "Thomas!" Dinah screamed, lunging forward. Someone caught her, wrapping chains around her wrists with practiced efficiency. She kept screaming his name, her voice raw and broken, and Thomas kept fighting even as they forced him to his knees, even as one of them hit him across the face hard enough to split his lip. "Stop," Howell ordered. "Don't damage the Colonel's son more than necessary. He wants him brought back alive." Thomas tasted blood. Through blurred vision, he saw Dinah being dragged toward the barn door, still screaming, still fighting despite the chains. Their eyes met for one final moment, hers filled with anguish and love and something that looked like goodbye. Then someone hit Thomas again, harder this time, and darkness swallowed him whole. The journey back to Burke County existed in Thomas's memory as fragments, disconnected images that never quite formed a complete picture. He woke tied to a horse, his head pounding, dried blood crusted on his face. Ahead of him, Dinah sat chained in a wagon, her wrists raw where the metal had rubbed them bloody. They traveled during the day now. No more hiding. The slave catchers were proud of their catch, making sure everyone they passed saw what happened to people who broke the rules. In towns they rode through, white people came out to stare. Some shouted curses. Others just watched with expressions ranging from disgust to pity to satisfaction that justice was being served. In the quarters of plantations they passed, enslaved people watched from doorways and fields, their faces carefully blank, but their eyes speaking volumes. They'd heard the story. Now they were seeing how it ended. When they reached the Caldwell plantation 3 days later, word had preceded them. A crowd had gathered, neighbors, curiosity seekers, people who wanted to witness the conclusion of the scandal that had consumed Burke County for a week. Colonel Caldwell stood on the front porch of the plantation house. Thomas had expected rage, had braced himself for his father's fury. Instead, what he saw was worse. The colonel looked destroyed. Not angry, destroyed. His face had aged years in the days Thomas had been gone. His eyes were hollow, haunted by something that looked like grief. He watched as they pulled Thomas from the horse, watched his son stumble and nearly fall, watched the slave catchers present Dinah in chains like she was evidence in a trial. "Take her to the cellar," Colonel Caldwell said quietly, "and bring my son inside." The cellar was a root storage pit that doubled as punishment for enslaved people who defied orders, a hole in the ground covered by wooden doors, dark and airless and designed to break spirits. They threw Dinah inside without ceremony, and she hit the dirt floor hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. Above ground, in the kitchen, Patience heard the commotion and knew immediately what had happened. Her daughter was back. And from the sound of the colonel's voice when he gave orders, she wouldn't be staying long. Patience wasn't allowed to see Dinah for 2 days. When she finally was, they gave her 10 minutes in the cellar. 10 minutes to say everything that needed saying between a mother and daughter who would never see each other again. Dinah was dirty, exhausted, but somehow unbroken. She looked at her mother with eyes that had seen something beyond these plantation walls, something worth dying for even if they hadn't reached it. Was it worth it? Patience whispered, holding her daughter as tightly as the chains would allow. "Yes," Dinah said without hesitation. "Mama, yes. For 3 days I was free. I was seen. I was loved. However this ends, I had that." Patience wept against her daughter's shoulder, silent, shaking sobs that carried every loss she'd ever endured. Within a week, the sale was arranged. Not to Alabama, as originally planned. Colonel Caldwell wanted Dinah gone completely, sent somewhere she'd never be heard from again. He chose a rice plantation in South Carolina's Lowcountry, a place known for brutal conditions and mortality rates that made it essentially a death sentence. The morning they came to take her, Patience was allowed one final embrace. They held each other at the plantation gate, both trying to memorize the feel of the other's arms, the sound of the other's breathing, the reality of each other's presence. "Be strong," Patience whispered. "Remember who you are. Remember you were loved enough that someone risked everything for you." "I love you, Mama. I love you more than words can say." Then they pulled Dinah away, loaded her into a wagon with 3 other enslaved people being transported south, and drove away down the dirt road that led out of Burke County. Patience stood there long after the wagon disappeared, her hands still raised in farewell, her face wet with tears she didn't bother to wipe away. Inside the plantation house, Thomas was locked in his room on the 2nd floor. He'd been kept there since their return, allowed no visitors, no information, no contact with anyone. He didn't know where Dinah was. Didn't know if she was still on the plantation or if they'd already sold her away. He pressed his face against the window glass, desperate for any glimpse of her, but saw nothing except the empty yard below. He never got to say goodbye. Years later, people who'd been there that day would remember two things: the mother standing alone at the gate long after her daughter was gone, and the sound of someone weeping in the locked room upstairs, weeping like his heart had been torn out and carried away in a wagon headed south. Both were true. The system that had enslaved Dinah and privileged Thomas had won. It always won. But what it couldn't erase was the 3 days they'd spent free, or the love that had driven them to risk everything, or the truth that they'd seen each other as fully human when the entire world insisted it was impossible. That truth would outlive the plantation. It would outlive slavery itself. But on that April morning in 1853, as Dinah rode away in chains and Thomas wept in his locked room, that knowledge offered no comfort at all. What happened to Thomas Edward Caldwell after that April morning exists only in fragments. Testimonies collected decades later, stories passed down through families, pieces of a puzzle that never quite forms a complete picture. The official record is almost silent. There were no criminal charges, no trial, no public accounting of what Thomas had done. Colonel Caldwell had enough wealth and influence to prevent legal proceedings that would have turned the scandal into permanent public record. Instead, Thomas simply disappeared from society as though he'd never existed. The accounts of where he went contradict each other in ways that suggest no one really knew the truth. Some said Colonel Caldwell had his son declared mentally unsound, that Thomas was committed to an asylum in Atlanta where he spent his remaining years sedated and forgotten. Others claimed he was taken to a distant family property in Tennessee, essentially imprisoned there under the watch of relatives who'd agreed to keep him hidden from the world. The most detailed testimony came from Ruth, an enslaved woman who'd worked in the Caldwell house for 15 years. In 1889, when she was an old woman and slavery was long abolished, a historian collecting oral histories found her living in Augusta. She still remembered Thomas. They kept him locked in that upstairs room for weeks, Ruth said, her voice carrying the weight of things she'd witnessed but couldn't prevent. We could hear him through the walls, weeping, calling her name in the darkness like a prayer. Dinah, over and over. Dinah. Ruth described one confrontation between father and son that everyone in the house heard, shouting that echoed through the rooms like thunder, making the servants freeze in place wherever they were working. The colonel was begging him, Ruth recalled, demanding he admit it was madness, that he'd been influenced by northern ideas or sickness or something that could be cured. He offered Thomas everything: forgiveness, his inheritance, his place in society, if he'd just renounce what he'd done. Just say he'd been temporarily insane and it meant nothing. Ruth paused, remembering. Master Thomas refused. Said he'd rather die than pretend he hadn't loved her. Said loving her was the only sane thing he'd ever done. The colonel walked out of that room, looking like he'd buried his son already. What's certain is that Thomas never married Catherine and Hartwell. The engagement was quietly dissolved. The Hartwell family compensated somehow for the embarrassment. Thomas never inherited the Caldwell plantation. His name was removed from family Bibles where births and marriages were recorded. Portraits that had hung in the main hall were taken down and stored in the attic or destroyed. He became a ghost in his own family's history. A son who'd existed until he didn't, erased as completely as they could manage. Dinah's fate is even harder to trace. Rice plantations in South Carolina's lowcountry kept minimal records of individual enslaved people. To the plantation owners, they were interchangeable labor units, bodies to work the flooded fields until malaria or exhaustion or brutality claimed them, then replaced by new bodies purchased at auction. Most people sent to those plantations disappeared from history completely. No letters, no testimonies, no evidence they'd ever existed beyond a sale receipt and a ledger entry. But one fragment survived. In 1856, 3 years after Dinah was sold south, A Quaker abolitionist named Elizabeth Morris visited several rice plantations in South Carolina, documenting conditions and collecting testimonies for anti-slavery publications in the North. In a letter to her sister dated November 1856, Elizabeth described meeting a young woman who'd made an impression on her. There was one girl, perhaps 19 or 20, named Dinah, who possessed remarkable intelligence. She could read and write, extraordinary for one in her position. The overseers punished her with extra labor for teaching other slaves their letters, but she persisted anyway. She told me about a love affair that had cost her everything, a relationship with a white man who'd tried to help her escape to freedom. They'd been caught after 3 days. She spoke of him with such tenderness, such unshakable conviction that what they'd shared was real and worth the price she was paying. For 3 days I was free, she told me. Not just from bondage, but free to be seen as myself, to be loved for who I was. That memory sustains me through everything else. I expected to find her broken by her circumstances. The rice fields are brutal beyond description. But she seemed like someone who had witnessed something beautiful once, and drew strength from the memory even as it caused her pain. She carried herself with a dignity that no amount of oppression had managed to destroy. Was this the same Dinah who'd fled the Caldwell plantation with Thomas? The letter doesn't say. Elizabeth Morris never recorded last names of enslaved people she met, and Dinah was a common name in the South. But the details fit. The age, the literacy, the story of attempted escape with a white man. The refusal to be broken despite everything. The records don't provide certainty. History rarely does when it comes to people the system tried to erase. But 3 years after being sold to what should have been a death sentence, a young woman who might have been Dinah was still alive, still teaching others, still carrying the memory of love like a light in the darkness. Whether she survived beyond that, whether she ever found freedom, whether she thought of Thomas in her final moments, these things were lost when the records stopped and silence took over. Both Thomas and Dinah became ghosts. Erased from official history, reduced to whispers and fragments and testimonies collected long after the fact. The system that destroyed them tried to pretend they'd never existed at all. But ghosts have a way of refusing to stay buried. The Caldwell plantation stood for 7 more years after Thomas and Dinah's capture. 7 years during which Colonel Edmund Caldwell aged rapidly, his hair going white, his posture stooping under weight that had nothing to do with physical labor. He died in 1861, officially of a stroke. The doctor signed the death certificate without hesitation. But the enslaved people who'd worked in the house whispered a different truth. That guilt had killed him as surely as any medical condition. That he'd spent his final years haunted by what he'd done to his own son, by choices that had preserved his reputation while destroying his family. He never spoke Thomas's name again after that terrible confrontation Ruth had overheard. Not once in the 7 years between the scandal and his death. When the Civil War came to Georgia, it came with fire. General Sherman's army marched through Burke County in November 1864, part of the infamous March to the Sea that left a path of destruction 60 miles wide from Atlanta to Savannah. The Caldwell plantation, like hundreds of others, was burned to the ground. The main house, that white columned monument to wealth built on human bondage, went up in flames that could be seen for miles. The stables burned. The outbuildings burned. Even the library where Thomas and Dinah had first met became ash and smoke and memory. The fields were eventually divided and sold to different owners. The quarters where Dinah had grown up, where patients had traced letters in dirt floors by candlelight, crumbled into Georgia soil and were reclaimed by weeds and time. Physical evidence of the Caldwell plantation simply ceased to exist. In 1877, the Burke County Courthouse burned in a fire that destroyed most records from the antebellum period. Birth certificates, property deeds, sale receipts, marriage licenses, all gone, including any official documentation of what had happened in April 1853. The remaining Caldwell family members had already left Georgia by then, scattering to other states, changing their narratives, scrubbing the scandal from their family histories. They told new neighbors in new towns that they'd lost everything in the war, which was true. They just never mentioned what they'd lost before the war started. By 1880, it was as though Thomas Edward Caldwell and Dinah had never existed at all. No courthouse records. No family acknowledgement. No official history. The system had tried to erase them completely. But erasure is never as complete as those in power hope it will be. The story survived in the memories of people who'd witnessed it, enslaved people and their descendants who passed the tale down through generations like a precious, dangerous heirloom. It survived in Ruth's testimony, collected by a historian 40 years after the events. It survived in Elizabeth Morris's letter describing a woman who might have been Dinah. It survived in whispers that became family legends in black communities across Georgia and South Carolina. It survived because it mattered. This wasn't just a story about two people who'd loved and lost. It was proof, dangerous, undeniable proof, that the entire racial hierarchy slavery depended on was built on a lie. The system insisted that black people and white people were fundamentally different, that they couldn't share intellectual connection, couldn't see each other as equals, couldn't love each other as humans. The entire structure of Southern society required everyone to believe this lie. Thomas and Dinah had exposed it as false. They'd proven that human connection could transcend every barrier the South had constructed. They'd demonstrated that even in the most oppressive system America ever created, love could bloom in the cracks, and that realization terrified those who'd built their power on denying such possibilities. That's why the story had to be erased. Not because it was scandalous, the South had plenty of scandals, but because it was true, and that truth undermined everything. But some truths refuse to stay buried. Even now, 170 years later, if you go to Burke County, Georgia, and talk to people whose families have deep roots there, particularly descendants of the people who were enslaved on those plantations, you'll hear whispers of the story. Not in courthouse records, not in official histories, not in family Bibles or historical markers, but in memory, in oral tradition, in stories passed from grandparents to grandchildren, kept alive by people who understood that some things are too important to let die. The Caldwell plantation is gone. The courthouse records are gone. The physical evidence is gone. But Thomas and Dinah, their names, their story, their dangerous love, survived anyway. Because fire can destroy buildings and documents. But it can't destroy memory. And it can't erase truth. Let's be honest about what this story is and what it isn't. Thomas and Dinah's story doesn't have a happy ending. There's no miraculous escape, no reunion, no justice that makes everything right. They weren't heroes who defeated an evil system. They were ordinary people, one born into privilege he didn't ask for, one born into bondage she never deserved, who made an extraordinary choice and paid a devastating price for it. The society they lived in viewed their love as the ultimate crime. More threatening than theft. More dangerous than violence. More worthy of erasure than murder. And that tells you everything you need to know about what really terrified the architects of slavery. Because Thomas and Dinah did something that the entire system depended on people believing was impossible. They saw each other, not as master and property, not as superior and inferior, not as the roles society had carved out for them since birth. They saw each other as fully, completely, undeniably human. And in a world built on the lie that such recognition was impossible between black and white, their love became an act of revolution. That's why their story had to be erased. That's why Thomas's name was removed from family records. That's why Dinah disappeared into the brutal anonymity of rice plantation labor. That's why the Caldwell family spent decades trying to scrub this scandal from memory. Not because it was shameful, though they certainly felt shame, but because it was proof that everything their society stood for was built on a foundation of lies. If a plantation heir and an enslaved girl could love each other as equals, if they could share intellectual conversations and see each other's humanity and be willing to sacrifice everything for a chance at freedom together, then what did that say about the entire racial hierarchy the South depended on? It said the hierarchy was false, that the supposed differences between races were invented, that the system enslaving millions of people was maintained through violence and lies rather than any natural order. Thomas and Dinah proved that, and for proving it, they had to be destroyed. But here's what the Caldwell family, and everyone like them, never understood. You can destroy people, but you can't destroy truth. The plantation burned. The courthouse records burned. The family moved away and changed their story. But the truth survived anyway, carried in the memories of people who'd witnessed it, passed down through generations who understood that some stories are too important to let die. 170 years later, we're still talking about Thomas and Dinah, still wrestling with what their story means, still asking the hard questions it raises. What does it say about a society that considered love more threatening than violence? That punished human connection more severely than brutality? That needed to erase evidence of compassion but preserved meticulous records of cruelty? We live in a nation still grappling with that history, still deciding what freedom really means, still fighting over whose stories get told and whose get buried, still learning, slowly, painfully, that the lies we built this country on have consequences that echo through centuries. Thomas and Dinah didn't change the system. The Civil War did that, and even then, the change was incomplete. The lies lived on in different forms, perpetuated through different means, causing different kinds of suffering. But their choice to love anyway, to risk everything for 3 days of freedom, to refuse to accept that the roles assigned to them were all they could be, that stands as testimony to something the most powerful forces in society couldn't fully extinguish. Human dignity. Human connection. The fundamental truth that we all deserve to love and be loved, regardless of the color of our skin or the chains others try to place on us. The Caldwell family couldn't erase what happened in April 1853. They could only prove what we already knew, that even the most powerful people feared what Thomas and Dinah represented. A truth so dangerous it had to be buried. A love so threatening it warranted total destruction. That truth outlived the plantation. It outlived slavery. It outlived everyone who tried to forget it. And it remains today, carved not into courthouse records or family Bibles, but into the collective memory of a nation still learning what it means to be free. Their story whispers through the Georgia pines even now, a reminder that love is an act of rebellion when the world demands hate, that humanity persists even when systems try to crush it, that some truths are too powerful to remain buried forever. Thomas and Dinah existed. They loved. They paid the price for daring to be human in a world that insisted they couldn't be. But they were human anyway. And that truth, simple, revolutionary, undeniable, is why we still tell their story 170 years later. Why we must keep telling it. Why we can never let it be forgotten again. Because the moment we stop remembering stories like theirs is the moment we risk repeating the same lies that made their tragedy necessary in the first place. Remember them. Remember what they risked. Remember what they proved. And remember that love, real love, the kind that sees another person's full humanity and cherishes it, has always been more powerful than the systems designed to keep us apart. That's the truth the Caldwell plantation couldn't burn. That's the truth that outlived slavery itself. And that's the truth we carry forward, one story at a time, refusing to let it die. What do you think of this story? Leave your comment below and tell me what you think about this complex story of power. If you found this exploration of a hidden scandal compelling, subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who appreciates history's darker truths. The past is never as simple as we wish it were. And the stories that make us most uncomfortable are often the ones most worth remembering because they teach us something essential about human nature and the structures of power that shape all our lives. See you in the next video.